Have you ever woken up to something that made you question whether you were still dreaming? Imagine setting up cameras because your child sleepwalks, only to catch something far darker than anyone could imagine. This is the story of a family whose worst nightmares came to life, and what they discovered would change their lives forever. It started like any other night in the small, quiet town of Asheville, North Carolina. The Wilson family lived on the outskirts, surrounded by thick woods that stretched for miles. The house was old but cozy, and their son, Jacob, loved the peace and tranquility of their rural life. Jacob, at 10 years old, had always been a curious, energetic child. But for months now, something strange had been happening. He would get up in the middle of the night and wander around the house, eyes closed, not speaking, not reacting to anything. It was as if he was in a trance, a deep sleep that didn't end until morning, when he would have no memory of what happened. His parents, Mike and Sarah, first chalked it up to typical sleepwalking. But after Jacob started showing signs of exhaustion during the day, they began to worry. He wasn't getting enough rest, and it was becoming harder for him to focus at school. His behavior was becoming more erratic, and he often seemed jumpy, as if something was lurking just out of his view. Mike decided they needed to figure out what was really going on. "We need to know what he's doing during the night," Mike said one evening as they discussed it. After some hesitation, they agreed to set up a camera in Jacob's room to capture his nocturnal movements. The first few nights were uneventful. Jacob got up at the usual time, wandered around the room, then returned to bed. Nothing to worry about, or so they thought. On the 5th night, Sarah had trouble sleeping. She kept glancing at the monitor on her phone, half expecting to see Jacob wander out of his bed, as he had the previous nights. She was right to be concerned. Around 2:30 a.m., the camera detected motion, and Jacob got up as usual. But this time, something was different. Sarah stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her chest. Jacob wasn't alone. 6 other children had entered the room, walking in perfect synchronization. They moved like marionettes, their eyes closed, their faces expressionless. They came from the dark hallway, their steps slow but steady, like they had done this 1,000 times before. The camera caught every eerie moment as the children filed into the room, standing around Jacob's bed. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, in perfect unison, they all turned to face the camera. It was as if they knew they were being watched, but none of them made a sound. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Mike," she whispered, but her voice failed her. Mike had already woken up, and they both stared at the screen, frozen in disbelief. The children were still, unblinking, their hands hanging by their sides like puppets who had lost their strings. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they all turned and filed out of Jacob's room, just as silently as they had entered. Sarah and Mike watched in stunned silence, barely able to comprehend what they had just seen. "Should we wake him up?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Mike didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the screen. But then, the camera caught something else. As the children disappeared into the hallway, a shadow moved, lurking just outside the frame. It was large, far too large to be a child. It moved quickly, vanishing into the dark, leaving only the sound of the floor creaking in its wake. The couple could hardly believe their eyes. They had to know what this meant. The next morning, Jacob woke up as if nothing had happened. He seemed perfectly fine, tired, but no different than usual. He had no memory of what had transpired during the night, not even of the other children in his room. But Sarah and Mike could not shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. They rushed to the backyard, their hearts pounding with dread. What they found was enough to freeze their blood. In the middle of the yard, there was a large, muddy circle. It looked like a ritualistic pattern, the earth trampled and disturbed as if something heavy had been dragged through it. At the center of the circle was a burnt mark, the charred ground still smoking slightly. The smell of something foul hung in the air. "Mike, what is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Mike replied, his face pale. He knelt beside the burned area, inspecting it closely. "But I've never seen anything like it." They couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever had been happening in their house, whatever that shadow had been, it wasn't normal. And it wasn't over. Over the next few days, Sarah and Mike grew increasingly paranoid. They spoke to neighbors, hoping someone had seen something unusual. But no one had. Jacob, though, began to act stranger than ever. He was distant, often lost in thought, staring out of the windows as if expecting something. Then, on the 7th night, they decided to act. They would follow the children. They would find out where they came from and what they wanted with Jacob. That night, Sarah and Mike waited until Jacob began his usual sleepwalking routine. They grabbed their jackets and silently followed him out of the house. They didn't know what to expect, but they couldn't sit by any longer. As they crept through the trees behind their house, the sound of footsteps echoed from the woods. The children had returned. They were moving in perfect synchrony once again, walking toward the same location as before. As they neared the center of the woods, the family froze. There, in the clearing, stood an old, dilapidated cabin. Its windows were dark, and the door creaked open in the wind. But there was something far worse than the cabin, the shadows moving inside it. The children, Jacob included, were drawn to the door, as if they were being called. The door swung open, revealing a figure cloaked in dark robes. It was the figure they had seen in the shadows, a tall, ominous presence that loomed over the children. "Jacob!" Mike shouted, rushing forward. But the children didn't react. They didn't even look back. Jacob, eyes closed, stepped forward into the cabin, disappearing from sight. And just like that, the door slammed shut. The air grew thick with a strange energy, the shadows in the woods growing darker and colder. Mike and Sarah were left standing, their hearts racing, the night air filled with the haunting silence. They had no idea what they had just discovered, but they knew one thing for sure: their son was not just sleepwalking. Something far more sinister was happening, and the nightmare was far from over. As they turned to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, closer now, almost as if they were being followed.